Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about imperialism. So I have the definition of imperialism up on the screen for you. Imperialism is the policy in which stronger nations extend their economic, political, or military control over weaker territories. If I'm to break that down into a little bit easier way to understand it, basically it's a country or government's their idea or their plan for how they are going to take over or control these weaker territories, these weaker nations. And the idea behind this is that those weaker territories, they probably have resources that the other country or the stronger country wants. And these resources could be things like lumber, they could be coal, it could be gold, it could be silver. But these stronger countries want to take over these weaker countries so that they can get those resources to make themselves stronger or to make themselves more money. Well, with imperialism, Great Britain, Germany, France, Russia all started doing this, especially with Great Britain, Germany, and France in Africa. And the United States sees these other world powers taking these territories and becoming more powerful and making a lot of money. And they also see to the south of the U.S. that Spain still has control of some territories. And the U.S. is like, well, if all of these other world powers are going to do this, we want some of this too. We want in on this action. We want some of our own territories. We want our own, what they called colonial possessions. And so the U.S. begins to try and take or get territories. And this is going to lead us into the Spanish-American War. Now, part of the path, or the journey of the U.S. getting into the Spanish-American War, is through something called yellow journalism. And yellow journalism was started by these two men who owned newspapers. One was named Joseph Pulitzer, and the other was named William Randolph Hearst. And you might have heard of like Pulitzer, the Pulitzer Prize. It is named after that guy. But what happened was they wanted to sell newspapers. I mean, they're in business. Well, when things were calm and nothing major was going on, they realized that they weren't selling a lot of newspapers. And these men were in competition for each other. But if something kind of crazy happened, or they had this really, like, fantastic story, people bought more newspapers. So what happened was these two men started writing these kind of crazy stories about Spain and what was happening in Latin America, especially down in Cuba, because there were the Spanish were very controlling, and they treated the people in Cuba not well at all. And so these two men started using this yellow journalism to write about the Spanish and tell these crazy stories. And what happened is that people started to get mad at the Spanish, especially when more and more people started to flee Cuba and come into the United States, and they were trying to get people in the United States to be involved and help their relatives that were still in Cuba. But what happened was with this yellow journalism, people really got upset and started to want to almost go to war with Spain. And so it starts these feelings within the United States. And then what happens is that we have a naval ship, a U.S. naval ship that is in a harbor, and it blows up. And the ship was known as the Maine. And when the Maine blows up, it kills a lot of U.S. servicemen. And it was this huge explosion, and you can see by the pictures, the Maine was destroyed. And what the newspapers do is they start running these stories, and they blame the Spanish. And they're like, the Spanish blew up our ship. Remember the Maine. look what the Spanish did. We can't let them get away with this. Remember the Maine. And it becomes the headline, Remember the Maine. Well, the thing is there's not really evidence that shows that the Spanish blew up the Maine, but once again, these are newspapers and they're wanting to sell, they're wanting to sell these. And it was a way for the U.S. to kind of get into this imperialism. So what ends up happening is that Spain will end up declaring war on the United States on April 24th, 1898, and this will begin the Spanish-American War. One of the most famous groups of the Spanish-American War are the Rough Riders, and the Rough Riders were led by Theodore Roosevelt. So Theodore Roosevelt led them, and you have the Battle of San Juan Hill, one of the most famous battles. Well, the war ends up being done in 3 months. Pretty short war. The U.S. Does very well. Our military, under a man named Dewey, takes out the Spanish Armada. And when people would ask Theodore Roosevelt or Teddy Roosevelt about it, he would say it was a splendid little war. And you can see this is Theodore Roosevelt right here, posing with his Rough Riders. And if you've seen a Night at the Museum, you've probably seen that they show him in his military regalia. So a 3-month war, what does the U.S. get out of this 3-month war? Well, we get the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. And we'll get back to the Philippines in a little bit. The Philippines, we had actually promised were going to become independent, but we'll talk about what happens. Cuba becomes an independent nation, but the U.S. actually stays and keeps troops in Cuba for years, saying that they're helping to protect Cuba from other countries taking it over. Really what happened was the U.S. had a lot of the businessmen in the U.S. had a ton of money in Cuba, so they were trying to protect their business interests. But the U.S. stays in Cuba for a number of years, and then we will remove our troops. So getting back to the Philippines. So as I said, the Philippines, following the Spanish-American War, wanted to be independent. But the U.S. was in this idea, this mindset of imperialism. We want colonial possessions. We want territories. And so the U.S. decided to annex the Philippines, or bring in the Philippines, make it part of the United States. And the Philippines didn't want that. They wanted to be independent. And so what happens is a huge revolt happens in the Philippines. There's a war. And it was a very brutal war. A lot of guerrilla warfare happened. And in fact, anywhere between 7 to 10 times more men are going to die. U.S. men are going to die fighting in the Philippines than they do in the Spanish-American War. And so it was very important, because what happens is, following the Philippines, when all of these stories start coming into the United States about what is happening in the Philippines, some people are going to start looking at imperialism, and they're going to say, really, is imperialism okay? Are we all right with this? And a group of very well-educated, very intellectual people are going to decide that imperialism is not okay. And they are going to be what are known as the anti-imperialists. And they are going to say that imperialism goes against what the United States stands for: freedom, independence. And so they are going to begin to try and convince people in the United States that imperialism is not good. And what happens is, following the Philippines, before the Philippines, people were like, yeah, imperialism, we get new markets to sell stuff, we get money, we get territories, we get stronger in the U.S. But as people started thinking about what was happening with the Philippines, a lot of people in the U.S. began to change their minds about imperialism. Well, while the U.S. is going through all of this and getting all of these imperialism, on this imperialism tide, I guess you could say, we in the U.S. decide that they are going to annex or bring in Hawaii. And Hawaii is brought into the United States, or annexed, in 1898. This picture that you're looking at is the last independent ruler of Hawaii. This is Queen Lily. And what happened is there were a bunch of American businessmen and planters that were living in Hawaii. And these men stage a revolution, and they overthrow the Hawaiian government, and the U.S. military is there, and they take over control of the Hawaiian government, and Queen Lily has to step down. She is no longer queen after that. And then the U.S. annexes in Hawaii, and then very shortly, Hawaii becomes a territory of the United States. So you might be asking, why Hawaii? Why would they take it? And the reason is, if you look at a picture, so here's Hawaii, maybe you'll notice that it's about halfway between the United States and Asia. And also, in Hawaii, there's a beautiful harbor. It's called Pearl Harbor, and it's a perfect spot for a military base. And so what Hawaii allowed for the U.S. Was a place to have a very strong military presence in the Pacific Ocean. It's also going to be why Hawaii is going to want to keep Guam and the Philippines. As we're continuing on talking about kind of this idea of imperialism, and as the U.S. is expanding during this time, one of the other things that the U.S. is going to control for a lot of years is the Panama Canal. So if you'll remember, there wasn't a direct water route to get from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, unless you went all the way around South America. And that took a long time, and it was very dangerous, and there were certain times of the year that you couldn't even do it. And so what people start doing is they're like, hey, what if we just built a canal and we connected the two oceans? And there's this spot in what will become Panama that was perfect. It was really narrow, and so they decide to dig a canal. And what that will do is allow for ships to easily get from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And the United States is going to get control. They're going to build and get control of the Panama Canal. And they'll do this through a treaty with the country of Panama when it becomes a country. So the U.S. will be in charge of it. And what it allowed was not only the business people, the merchants in the United States, to quickly get supplies, but it also allowed the United States Navy to get from one ocean to the other quickly, to transport goods and men and ships. And so that is the Panama Canal.
Down in Cuba, the people were oppressed by Spain and the General and the U.S. They saw this mess as a chance to expand and spread business. Hertz and Pulitzer spread war fever with yellow journalism. Remember the maids who hell with Spain, we want more. Though there's no evidence to pin blame on Spain for the explosion, the public is still in uproar, calling for the Spanish-American War. Do we beat Spain at Manila Bay? Once again, the Spanish Armada is belayed, because wooden ships are no match for our navy. The crowd roars, it's a splendid little war, Spanish-American War. You want a thrill? Kick someone hill. After Buffalo soldiers get credit still. The war was quick, and Spain got licked. Less of our troops died fighting than getting sick. Cuba, Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, are ours. Now what could go wrong? We don't keep Cuba because of the Telemann, but can intervene for peace without their consent, and at Guantanamo Bay for imprisonment. All because the Spanish-American War, no sample goes to Puerto There's still more. The Spanish-American War. Remember the Maine and do well with Spain. Remember the Maine. Remember the Maine and do well with Spain. Remember the Maine. The Philippines fought wanting their independence. Guerrilla war waged between them and the U.S. 4,000 American troops died, that is 10 times more than the Spanish-American War. We kept them and what we have access to China's markets, Europe's spheres of influence. Better open the door, our empire commence the ground roars. It's a splendid little war. It's a splendid little war. Spanish-American War.
That was the Spanish-American